Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be the next one in our video series Written in Stone about the changes that took place in calendars spread all across the globe and cultures worldwide about 2,700 years ago, from 360-day years to 365-day years. Now, about the same time, 2,700 years ago, the prophet Daniel recorded in the Bible, in his book, and you can see this today, Daniel chapter 2 and verse 21, where it says, God is changing months and years. So what Daniel was doing was he was attributing the change in the calendar to an act of God. And so we're going to take a little bit more deeper look at some evidence that this actually happened just using basic math. Now before we start, I want to address something that seems to come up quite a bit. In every one of these videos, someone says, what is the big deal about changing some numbers on a piece of paper? Well, that's not at all what happened here. Our year, as it exists on paper, describes how the actual year works for us. In other words, a passing of all 4 seasons. So from the middle of winter to the middle of winter, it's 365 days now, but what I'm saying is at one time it was 360 days. If those people had a 365-day year and a 360-day calendar, they would have ended up, after just a short amount of years, they would have ended up celebrating winter in the middle of summer. To an agrarian society, that's suicide. So, anyway, just so that we can all have a basic understanding of how this works, I'm going to just demonstrate. Say this is the Earth. Through the Earth is an axis, and the Earth spins on that axis. When the Earth is straight up and down facing the sun, that's called a vernal equinox. And when the Earth is leaning, that's called the solstice. For the southern hemisphere, if it's leaning this way, they're experiencing summer because they're closer to the sun. While we, up here on the northern hemisphere, would be experiencing winter. Over the course of time, you would be facing the other direction. In fact, that's 180 days in a 360-day calendar. And in our calendar, to go all the way through the entire cycle takes 365 days. At one time, it was 360. Now, the Earth doesn't actually move on its axis. What happens, the axis stays stationary. But the Earth goes around the sun. And see what happens as you're going around the sun, the direction that you're facing changes. So if you go completely around the sun, in 360 days, you have a 360-day year. Now, we're going to look at some measurements, units of measure that are recorded in the Bible. Not an inch, not a foot, not a cubit, none of that. We're going to talk about measurements, units of measure regarding time. And the first unit of measure we're going to talk about is the day. The day for us is 24 hours. Back then, we don't know what it was because we do not have any explanation written in the Bible as to how the day changed, only that it did, or that the calendar changed. But one day is how long it takes for us to do a complete rotation. So, you know, we wake up, the sun comes up, 24 hours later, the sun comes up again. That's a day. In 30 days, you would experience a month on a 30-day calendar. Right now, it takes us about 29.5 days. And what that is in our relative position with the moon, we'll experience all of the moon phases. So you start off with a new moon. That's when the moon is completely black. And you pass through the phases till it's completely white, and then it goes back to black again. When the moon is completely darked out, we're looking directly at the dark side of the moon, that would be a new moon. So from new moon to new moon is 30 days. That is a measure of time, a month. So a day is what, you know, the amount of time it takes for the sun to make or the Earth to completely turn so that we see the sun up. The month is when we see the moon go through all of its phases, and then we have a year. Well, a year is the amount of time it takes the Earth to go through all of its cycles and get back to, well, however you measure your years. But there are other measurements that are mentioned that we haven't spoken of. We know that in a 365-day year, the months do not match up with the years. So there's no synchronization there. But another measurement that we haven't talked about yet is a week. A week is a period of 7 days. And a week is specifically mentioned as a unit of measure in the Bible. So How would a 7-day week work with a 365-day year? Well, it comes out to something like, I don't know, 52.3 or 51.9, somewhere in there. It's about 52 weeks in a year. But in a 360-day year, what does it do? Basically the same thing. There's not much correlation. But in 7 years, there is. With a 365 and a quarter day year. We're going to revert to our modern calendar. Our modern calendar has nothing to do with the ancient calendar, but because we're used to it, it makes things easier to understand. Say that January the 1st fell on a Monday. Well, at the end of 360 days, you're not going to fall on Monday again. You'll fall on one of the other days. And you'll go through a series of these for 7 years. But at the end of 7 years, you fall back on a Sabbath, or a Monday, which is not a Sabbath, but that's what we're going to talk about as units of measure. So in 7 years, every 7 years, you would experience the same day you experienced 7 years earlier. So January 1st is Monday. 7 years later, January 1st would be Monday. And the reason that's important is because another unit of measure is a Sabbath year, or 7 years. 7-year period between Sabbath years. And so it makes sense if you've got every Sabbath year starting on the same day. But with a 365-day calendar, there is no cycle. I mean, even if you think you can develop a pattern mathematically, it's not a useful pattern. So now we've got our next unit of measure, which isn't really a unit of measure, but in the Bible, the Jews, the Jewish people, were told that every 49 years they had to redistribute property. You know, no one could own property perpetually. It was evenly distributed amongst everybody, and just in case something happened, like maybe somebody's family didn't have any children, and so now they got a big piece of land that doesn't belong to anyone, or somebody may have had 20 children, and everybody's living on a small piece of land. Well, they would redivide the land every 49 years. If you take and figure January 1st is a Monday, 7 years later is a Monday, 7 years later is a Monday, what happens is, over a course of 7 Sabbath years, on the very first day of the very first month of the very first year, you will have Monday again at the beginning of the Jubilee. Like I say, though, that's not a real unit of measure for time so much as it's just a festival that there had to be some kind of way to mark that time. And there's a difference. Later on, the next video I make in this series, I'll explain that. But there is another unit of time, unit of measure for time that's recorded in the Bible. And it's alluded to when it says that a day is like a year for God. You know, there's a day for a year, a day for a year. A day is like a year in God. For God, a year is but a day. Or a day is, yeah, a year is but a day. Now, this is, you know, most of us understand that what that's talking about is God has lived for all eternity, so 1,000 years isn't a very long time for him to have to wait for something. But it also alludes to the fact that he perceives 1,000 years as a unit of measure the same way that he perceives a day as a unit of measure, or a week as a unit of measure, or a month as a unit of measure. So if we have Sabbath days and we have Sabbath years, then we also must have Sabbath millenniums. So on the first day of the first month of the first year of the first millennium, you would have a Monday, and that would happen again 7 millenniums later. So see, this is all organized. It says in the Bible somewhere in 1 Corinthians, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. So he associates peace with order. Not of disorder, but of order, of peace. And that's not just talking about order within the family or peace within the family. It's talking about order throughout the universe, order in the solar system. And a lot of us think that there is, because we can see that things stay in their orbits and go where they're supposed to go. But I guess it's like they say, you ain't seen nothing yet, because we're about to go into a system that is extremely orderly. And in a 365-day year with 29.5-day months, that can never happen. You will never be able to make an association between weeks and days, or days and years, or weeks and years. But with a 360-day calendar, all of that works out. Just more evidence that the calendar has changed.